50,000 people moving out of their homes. Not during active street fighting, not during a ground invasion, not during any of the conditions that have historically triggered mass civilian displacement from a major city. They are moving because the military concluded it could not protect them. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment before we go any further. The Israeli Defense Forces, one of the most sophisticated military organizations on the planet, equipped with layered air defense systems that NATO allies have spent years studying and trying to replicate, reached an internal conclusion that the missile threat facing northern Haifa had surpassed what their interception systems could reliably stop. And instead of pretending otherwise, they started moving people out. I have spent the last 4 days reviewing civil defense documents circulating among Israeli emergency management officials. These are not casual suggestions that residents might want to consider a temporary relocation. These are not shelter-in-place advisories for people with mobility issues. These are systematic evacuation orders covering the northern coastal districts and industrial zones of Israel's third largest city. 50,000 human beings told to leave because the balance between incoming threats and defensive capability has shifted in a direction that military planners cannot openly admit, but apparently cannot ignore. What I want to do over the next half hour is give you the analysis that transforms this evacuation from a simple news headline into a true understanding of the strategic turning point we are actually standing at. Why these specific systems changed every calculation. Why Haifa specifically sits at the crossroads of geography, industrial infrastructure, and military logistics in ways that make it simultaneously the most vital and most vulnerable city in northern Israel. And what unfolds in this theater over the coming month will decide whether the current conflict expands into something that reshapes the entire region for a generation. There is a fundamental principle in military analysis that technology does not override geography. It interacts with it. Understanding why Haifa is uniquely exposed to the current threat environment requires understanding what Haifa actually is, not just as a city, but as a critical node in Israel's physical and economic backbone. Haifa sits on the Mediterranean coast, roughly 35 kilometers south of the Lebanese border. That distance sounds like a meaningful buffer until you translate it into flight times. A subsonic cruise missile designed to fly low and hug terrain contours, the kind specifically built to evade radar detection, covers that distance in about 12 minutes. A ballistic missile, in its final descent phase, already traveling at maximum velocity, covers that distance in 4 minutes against certain hypersonic delivery platforms that intelligence assessment suggests may already exist in Hezbollah. As inventory, the warning window shrinks to seconds rather than minutes. The city is built up the northern face of Mount Carmel, which rises over 500 meters above sea level. This topography creates a natural north-facing exposure. The city essentially opens toward Lebanon like a stadium facing its field. Incoming missiles launched from southern Lebanon have a largely unobstructed flight path to any target inside the urban area. But the geographic exposure is only half the story. What actually sits inside that exposure makes the situation exponentially worse. Haifa's port is Israel's largest by volume, processing approximately 26 million tons of cargo every year. This is not just commercial traffic. It is the physical lifeline for Israel's military logistics, its industrial raw materials supply chain, its food import infrastructure, and its energy resupply systems. A port is not simply an economic asset. It is the point through which everything that an island economy and Israel in wartime functions essentially as an island economy receives what it cannot produce at home. Right next to the port are petrochemical facilities, including refineries, that process roughly 60% of Israel's domestic petroleum consumption. These facilities cannot be easily moved, hardened, or replaced. They are fixed infrastructure whose disruption would instantly cascade into fuel prices, military vehicle operations, power generation, and civilian heating and transportation across the entire country. The Matam Technology Park in the city's southern districts employs over 14,000 workers in defense electronics, cybersecurity systems, and advanced manufacturing. This is the kind of concentrated, specialized workforce whose output directly sustains military capability and whose loss cannot be compensated for by simply hiring alternative workers somewhere else. Haifa is in functional terms 3 strategic targets merged into one geographic location: a major port, a critical energy processing hub, and a defense industrial complex. When Israeli planners assess the threat environment in the north, they are not primarily worried about population casualties in the abstract. They are worried about the cascading disruption to national military capability that would result from successful strikes on these concentrated infrastructure nodes, and that is precisely what the missile systems currently positioned just across the border were designed to threaten. The Israeli public and much of the international audience still understand Hezbollah's rocket arsenal through the framework of previous conflicts. Thousands of unguided rockets that follow ballistic trajectories anyone can calculate. Rockets that Iron Dome intercepts at rates above 85%. Rockets that cause fear and periodic casualties but cannot reliably destroy specific infrastructure targets. That framework is now outdated. What has changed is precision, and precision changes absolutely everything. The Fateh 110 family of ballistic missiles that's developed in Iran and transferred to Hezbollah in multiple upgraded configurations over the past decade represents a qualitative category shift from the rocket arsenals of earlier conflicts. The baseline variant already offered extended range and payload beyond older systems. But the upgraded Fateh 313 configuration, which intelligence assessments indicate Hezbollah possesses in substantial quantities, delivers a circular error probable of under 10 meters across a range of 500 kilometers. 10 meters. That is not the margin of error of an artillery shell trying to hit a neighborhood. That is the margin of a weapon designed to hit a specific building, a specific storage tank, a specific section of port infrastructure. At that accuracy threshold, the distinction between area bombardment and precision strike becomes genuinely meaningful in a way it simply was not back in 2006. Hezbollah is estimated to possess somewhere between 400 and 700 of these systems. Compare that to the approximately 500 rockets of all varieties fired during the entire 34 days of the 2006 war, and you begin to understand the scale shift. But more important than the raw number is the combination of number with accuracy. Previous rocket campaigns imposed psychological costs on Israeli populations, but achieved limited infrastructure damage because unguided rockets cannot reliably hit specific targets. This arsenal can. The interception problem is compounded by terminal velocity. The Fateh 110 in its final descent phase is traveling at approximately Mach 3.5, roughly 4,200 kilometers per hour. Iron Dome's radar and interceptor combination was optimized for the threat environment of short-range rockets and artillery shells, which travel at subsonic speeds on predictable trajectories. Against those threats, it has performed effectively. against ballistic missiles arriving at Mach 3.5 with maneuvering capability in the terminal phase, performance degrades substantially. Israeli defense officials have acknowledged in closed briefings, details of which have been reported by Haaretz, that interception success rates against Fateh-class threats fall to somewhere between 50 and 65% under optimal conditions. Optimal conditions meaning clear weather, no electronic countermeasures deployed by the launching side, multiple interceptor rounds allocated per incoming missile, and detection within seconds of launch. The arithmetic behind this strategic reality becomes far more unsettling when translated from abstract military statistics into what it would actually look like on the ground. Imagine Hezbollah launches a salvo of just 10 Fateh 110 precision-guided missiles against a single critical infrastructure target inside Haifa's port district. Under ideal defensive conditions, Israeli interception systems might successfully destroy 6 or 7 of those missiles before impact. At first glance, that appears to be an impressive defensive performance. Yet military effectiveness is not measured by the number of interceptions. It is measured by what gets through. If 3 or 4 missiles reach their intended target, the consequences could be severe. A handful of successful strikes against a fuel storage facility, a major crane complex, electrical infrastructure, or a critical section of port operations could disable that facility for months. Modern industrial infrastructure is highly interconnected. Destruction of only a few key components can create cascading disruptions that affect an entire economic system. In this context, even a defense success rate exceeding 60% may still result in strategic failure if the surviving missiles hit the right targets. The economics of missile warfare introduce another layer of complexity that often receives less attention than the technical performance of defensive systems. An Iron Dome interceptor is estimated to cost approximately $50,000. A Fateh 110 missile costs Hezbollah significantly more, roughly $200,000 per unit. In small-scale engagements, this creates an economic advantage for the defender. The interceptor costs less than the weapon it destroys. However, warfare is rarely conducted under ideal conditions. During saturation attacks involving 50, 100, or even larger salvos arriving simultaneously against multiple targets, defensive commanders cannot rely on a single interceptor per incoming missile. To maintain acceptable kill probabilities, multiple interceptors are often allocated to each threat. As the volume of incoming fire increases, the economic equation begins to reverse itself. The attacker forces the defender to expend resources at an accelerating rate simply to maintain the same level of protection. More importantly, interceptor inventories are finite. Every missile defense system has a ceiling. Every launcher has a limited magazine. Every interceptor destroyed or expended must eventually be replaced. Unlike public political statements, mathematics is indifferent to rhetoric. An adversary can calculate inventory levels, estimate replenishment rates, and structure attacks around exhausting available defensive resources. This reality forms the backdrop to the third and perhaps most significant reason why the evacuation of parts of Haifa represents more than a temporary precaution. It reflects the existence of a launch infrastructure that Israeli air power has struggled to eliminate despite years of surveillance and repeated strikes. Following the 2006 Lebanon war, Hezbollah did not simply accumulate missiles and store them in warehouses waiting for future conflict. Instead, it embarked on a long-term effort to construct an extensive underground military network throughout southern Lebanon. Over more than a decade, this infrastructure evolved into one of the most sophisticated hardened launch systems operated by any non-state military organization in the world. According to satellite imagery assessments and defense analyses reported over the years, dozens of underground launch facilities have been identified, with some intelligence estimates suggesting the true number may be considerably larger. These are not improvised bunkers or simple tunnels. They are reinforced concrete installations buried deep beneath the surface, specifically designed to survive airstrikes and continue functioning under sustained military pressure. Inside these facilities, missiles are stored in carefully controlled environments that protect sensitive electronics and guidance systems from environmental degradation. Transportation routes connecting storage chambers to launch positions often remain concealed underground, minimizing detectable activity. Once launch orders are received, crews can prepare missiles for firing within minutes. By the time aircraft or surveillance assets identify the launch area, the missiles have already been fired and personnel have withdrawn back underground. This creates a fundamental challenge for air power. A launch site that has completed its mission leaves behind very little evidence. Heat signatures fade rapidly, visible activity disappears, communication emissions cease. What remains is often an empty launch position that no longer justifies the expenditure of expensive, precision-guided munitions. Consequently, Israel may spend hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions, of dollars per precision strike while achieving only limited reductions in the overall launch network. Even when individual facilities are destroyed, the broader system remains operational. The rate at which launch infrastructure can be repaired, replaced, or supplemented often exceeds the rate at which it can be eliminated. Yet the deepest strategic shift visible in Haifa's evacuation is not technological. It is psychological. For nearly 2 decades, the balance along Israel's northern border rested upon a doctrine of deterrence. The underlying assumption was straightforward. Hezbollah possessed a large and increasingly sophisticated missile arsenal, but would refrain from employing it on a large scale because the retaliatory costs imposed upon Lebanon would be unacceptable. The message was implicit but unmistakable. Any major missile campaign against Israeli cities would invite devastating retaliation against Lebanese infrastructure. Bridges, roads, power stations, ports, and urban strongholds associated with Hezbollah would face destruction. The expectation was that Hezbollah's political leadership would conclude that the costs outweighed any potential benefits. For years, that calculation appeared to hold. Today, however, there are growing indications that this deterrence framework is eroding. Hezbollah's leadership increasingly appears to believe that degradation of its military capabilities will continue regardless of restraint. Assassinations of senior commanders, repeated strikes against logistical networks, and public Israeli statements regarding military objectives in southern Lebanon have contributed to a perception that inaction offers no guarantee of security. From Hezbollah's perspective, restraint may simply postpone confrontation rather than prevent it. At the same time, Israel faces a more complicated international environment than it did during previous conflicts. The political consequences of large-scale destruction inside Lebanon have become increasingly significant. International scrutiny is more intense, global media coverage is more immediate, and diplomatic pressure can emerge rapidly. Decision-makers must therefore balance military objectives against political costs in ways that were less pronounced during earlier confrontations. Equally important is the evolution of Hezbollah's targeting strategy. Previous rounds of conflict focused heavily on military installations and communities near the border. Current strategic discussions increasingly emphasize economic targets. Ports, energy infrastructure, industrial facilities, and transportation hubs represent high-value objectives capable of generating disproportionate economic disruption relative to the number of weapons employed. This is precisely why Haifa occupies such a central place in strategic calculations. It is not merely another city. It is one of Israel's most important economic gateways, home to critical port facilities, industrial infrastructure, energy assets, and transportation networks that support the broader national economy. The decision to relocate tens of thousands of residents therefore reflects more than concern about civilian casualties. It represents an acknowledgement that critical economic infrastructure may be vulnerable to a level of risk that existing defensive measures cannot completely eliminate. To understand the broader implications, it is useful to step back from the Middle East entirely and examine a historical conflict separated from today's events by more than 2,000 years. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta offers an illuminating parallel. Athens entered that conflict as the dominant commercial and naval power of the Greek world. Its wealth, maritime reach, and extensive alliance network appear to guarantee long-term superiority. Sparta possessed fewer economic advantages but enjoyed exceptional military discipline, geographic familiarity, and strategic patience. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Athens retained the ability to project power across the Aegean Sea, yet struggled to force Sparta into a conclusive engagement. Sparta could challenge Athenian ambitions on land, but lacked the capacity to completely destroy Athenian maritime dominance. The result was a prolonged contest of attrition that consumed resources, manpower, and political cohesion on both sides. While the two powers exhausted themselves, Persia observed from the sidelines. Rather than directly entering the conflict on a large scale, Persia supported conditions that prolonged mutual weakening. By the war's conclusion, neither victor nor defeated possessed the strengths they had enjoyed at the beginning. Persia achieved many of its strategic objectives without bearing the primary costs of the struggle. The relevance of this historical example lies not in identical circumstances, but in similar strategic dynamics. Israel today faces pressures across multiple theaters simultaneously. Military operations, border security concerns, missile defense requirements, and broader regional competition all demand resources. Hezbollah, meanwhile, does not necessarily need to achieve battlefield victory in a conventional sense. It only needs to sustain pressure at levels that impose continuous costs. The longer such a contest continues, the more resources are consumed, the more political debates intensify, and the more economic burdens accumulate. From this perspective, the evacuation of Haifa becomes significant not merely because of the number of people involved, but because of what it reveals about strategic planning. It suggests that decision makers are preparing for scenarios in which northern Israeli communities remain exposed to sustained missile threats despite substantial defensive efforts. This reality creates three broad pathways forward. The first is negotiated de-escalation. Through intermediaries and international mediation, both sides could accept compromises that fall short of their maximum objectives. Such agreements would likely be politically uncomfortable for all parties involved, but they would reduce immediate risks and stabilize the border. The second path is prolonged attrition. Airstrikes, missile exchanges, economic disruption, and periodic escalation continue without producing decisive outcomes. This scenario imposes long-term costs on both sides while leaving the underlying strategic dispute unresolved. The third path is major escalation. Ground operations, expanded missile campaigns, and broader regional involvement could fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. Such a scenario carries the highest risks and the greatest uncertainty, but it is also the path most likely to produce a significantly different post-conflict environment. What appears increasingly unlikely is a return to the assumptions that prevailed before the current crisis. The missile arsenals exist. The launch infrastructure exists. The strategic calculations on both sides have evolved. The limitations of missile defense against large-scale precision attacks are now understood more clearly than ever before. Ultimately, however, strategic analysis must not lose sight of the human dimension. The residents leaving northern Haifa are not statistics. They are families who built lives in communities they believed were secure. They are business owners watching customers disappear and economic activity slow. They are elderly residents separated from routines, support networks, and medical services that provide stability. They are workers whose livelihoods depend upon infrastructure that has suddenly become a potential military target. When a government evacuates civilians from an area not because fighting has already arrived, but because it fears its defenses may not be sufficient if fighting arrives, it sends a powerful message. It signals that the threat is no longer theoretical. It acknowledges limits, and it forces citizens to confront questions about security, leadership, and the future that are difficult to answer. The evacuation of Haifa is therefore more than a military precaution. It is a political signal, an economic warning, and a strategic indicator. Whether it ultimately leads to negotiation, prolonged confrontation, or wider conflict remains uncertain. What is certain is that the assumptions governing Israel's northern theater for much of the past 2 decades are being tested in ways that few policymakers can ignore. The tens of thousands already leaving their homes understand that something fundamental has changed. The challenge for analysts, policymakers, and military planners is determining exactly what that change means and where it leads next.